Hi, I'm Pablo Zabaleta and I welcome you to this video where we will be covering Chapter 4, Forecasting, of the Heizer and Render book. So, as usual, let's start with our outline. We will be covering forecasting, obviously, but differences with provision, how forecasting are made, the types of forecasts, the stages in the forecasting system. We will be covering a little bit about mathematics for the law of large numbers, forecasting approaches, time series components, qualitative methods overview, the quantitative methods overview, and we'll also cover a little bit about correlation analysis, something that you have seen in previous courses. Now, let's start directly with what is forecasting. In the book, they define it as the art and science of predicting future events. Yes, it's true, and in the dictionary, if you go and search for it, you will find some of the following definitions. The action to arrange what is appropriate to meet contingencies or foreseeable needs. See ahead of time, know or guess by some signs or indications what will happen, and arrange or prepare means against future contingencies. So, essentially, what is forecasting? Forecasting is using tools in order to try to get closer to what the future holds. If we know that our demand for tomorrow will be 100 plus or minus 10, that is different than just a guess and say, okay, prepare 1,000 and have 900 extra, which we won't be needing. But forecasting is, as I told you, an approximation. We try to discern or find out in the best possible manner what the future holds. But it's different from provision. In provision, we just set aside something, we saved it or we reserve it for a purpose. So, if we have to compare forecast with provision, in the forecast, the resources that we are separating to be used are estimated. There is uncertainty involved. We will try to get that uncertainty as low as possible, but there is always an element of uncertainty. With provisions, the thing's a little bit different. We know how much we're putting away and for what reason. There is no uncertainty. Mind you, in the case of the provision, we don't know yet what the future holds. But we do know how much we're setting aside for that purpose. For example, if we're saving for our children's college, we don't know exactly how much we're going to spend in the future. But we do know that that money is set aside and we won't touch it because that is directed for one purpose only. So, there's no uncertainty that we're taking aside these resources, so we don't have them available for use today, but those resources are being set aside. There's no uncertainty about it for our children's education. We also can set aside, for example, water, food for use in case of emergency. Food rations, batteries, all that kind of stuff that some people save just in case there's a hurricane or whatever. So those are an example of provisions. Whereas with forecasts, we assume that it's going to be more or less along these lines. Now, how are forecasts made? We think always in three terms of times, three frameworks of time: short, medium, and long term. And what do we mean by those those time frameworks? Usually, but be careful with this, short is between 1 week and 1 year. Medium is between 3 months and 3 years. Long is larger than 3 years. But always take this with a grain of salt. Why? What happens if you're underwater? What is your long term? Your long term is going to be measured in minutes because you can't breathe. If you have a very, very strong training, perhaps you're talking about 5 minutes. For the usual and normal person, around 45 seconds to 1 minute is long. 3 minutes, they're drowning. So, remember, long, short, medium are relative terms, and they must be used taking into consideration the reality of each business. So it depends entirely on whoever makes use of the tool, the time horizon. So, what happens with those time horizons? Well, usually for short periods, we tend to use more quantitative methodologies, while for longer periods, we tend to use more qualitative methodologies. So, the question that arises immediately is, why is this so? Well, it happens that all quantitative methodologies are based on the stationary state. And this means on the state that a system has arrived at a certain equilibrium. When time passes, changes in trends tend to accumulate to a degree that mathematical models will not work. So if you try to use, for example, a regression for the long term, the variations will accumulate so much that perhaps your line goes like this and your reality is over here. So be very, very careful with what you use. For short term, we tend to use quantitative methods. For longer term, qualitative methods. And remember, medium and long-term forecasts deal with larger and more aggregate issues. Short-term, on the other hand, use different methodologies. They tend to be more accurate than long-term forecasts, although this is very debatable. Why? An example that I can immediately bring to the table is that in the long term, for example, everybody dies. In this case, I will not be mistaken. That's 100% accuracy. Everybody dies in the long term. Now, what is the long term? That's another discussion. In the short term, perhaps I don't know who is going to die. Hopefully nobody. Even if I use a quantitative methodology, in the short term I won't be able to get much accuracy regarding this. And in the long term, with this affirmation, yes, I will be 100% accurate. So, depending on the phenomenon, accuracy is something that is highly debatable. But that's a matter for another course. Our lesson will continue in the next video.